Well, good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's having a great day. Appreciate you all joining us again. If you don't know me already, my name is Paul James. I'm the Director of Development and Publishing for the Knoxville History Project, and we're up on about week 4 with our weekly Zooms or History Happy Hours. We kind of retitled them. So thanks to Nicole and Jack for coming up with a little new framing of that. But our mission is to research and promote the history of culture of Knoxville. And one of the programs that many of you probably heard me talk about before is Knoxville History, Knoxville Shoebox Project. And I want to have a shout out for Cindy and Mark Proto, who have joined us many weeks. I'm not sure if they're on tonight, but if you are, hello, Cindy and Mark. They came in last week and they brought a copy of the Knoxville Fire Department annual from 1975. And this is just the kind of an example of the wonderful gems that whether you have them or you might find them for $5 at a flea market. I think that's what Cindy did with this one. But it's just an example of old books that have a tremendous amount of history. And sometimes they have images that you may not have seen on McClung or other local collections. There was just some amazing gems. One of the photographs that I've been trying to find, and I've seen maybe a couple in the last 2 or 3 years, is of the North Knoxville Fire Department, which would have been at Embry Place as we know it today, right next to the Central Market that was there in the late 1800s. And most of us undoubtedly know the Fireman's Memorial that is on Summit Hill, right in front of the downtown fire station. And I've wanted to find a photograph, as you can see on the right, of the statue when it was across the street at the old City Hall. And it was moved from the North Knoxville Fire Department, I think in about 1948, over to City Hall. And at the same time, they connected it with power by a cable. And you can see that they see this kind of lantern that the fireman is holding. If you drive down Summit Hill today, you will not see that lantern. It was not part of the original statue, but it was added in the late 40s and it lit up. Apparently it does exist somewhere, that lantern, but it's certainly not with the statue these days. But anyway, this is just an example. If you have anything like this of old brochures or booklets or postcards or anything that would be of interest, we're not asking you to donate them, just share with us so we could scan them or take a picture on a cell phone. So again, thanks to Cindy and Mark Proto. This is Knoxville Shoebox in action. Also want to shout out to council members Lynn Fugate and Charles Thomas. Again, thank you for supporting us through your 202 funds, this series. So I'm going to hand it over to Jack, and he's going to talk about tonight, St. Patrick's Day, the Irish in Knoxville.
All right, thanks for joining us, everybody, and happy St. Patrick's Day after party. This is the after party for St. Patrick's Day. It's a good enough holiday to celebrate 2 days a year, I think. Anyway, we're going to be talking about the Irish heritage of Knoxville, and I want to apologize at the beginning. This is just an outline, considering that there are tens of thousands of people in Knoxville, certainly, who have some kind of Irish heritage. How one island 4,000 miles away from Knoxville can have such be a big part of the history of a city in the Southern Appalachians is a rich and complicated story. Most of our conversation will be about the Catholic Irish tonight, as represented by this picture that we'll talk about later, most of whom arrived after the Great Famine. But first, I think we need to acknowledge the Scots-Irish. You've probably heard lots of stories about them. We have never done a program about them because there are so many programs about them. There are lots of very, very thick books about the Scots-Irish experience in America. And there are people who make a living giving talks about the subject, and I cannot hope to compete with them. That's another long and perhaps the most complicated story. But that, just to outline that, it starts with the nasty border wars in the lowland Scotland area with the English. At the same time that the English were strengthening their dominance of the neighboring island of Ireland, which began during the Tudor dynasty, especially during Henry VIII's time. Later on, James I, who was actually a Scottish king himself, had this interesting idea to send a lot of the troublesome lowland Scots to Ireland, and it seemed a clever solution to him because they were causing a lot of trouble on the main British Isle there. But to end the fighting in Scotland if they could, but also to increase the English-speaking Protestant presence in Ireland, which he thought would make it easier to Ireland easier to govern. But this was a big story in American history. After they were newcomers to Ireland in the 1600s, but in a few generations they were calling themselves Irish themselves, and I think had every right to. They had lived there. It was the only home that they had known for a few generations. If you were born in Ireland and your parents were born in Ireland, and maybe even your grandparents were born in Ireland, and you have no memory of Scotland, you may well think of yourself as Irish. And they probably never heard the term Scots-Irish, which is not a modern term, but is much more commonly used today than it was then. In fact, the border wars that caused the problem in Scotland were as distant to many of them as the Civil War is to us. So they may not have even known what their ancestors were up to in those days. We think of Ireland kind of simplistically, I think, as Protestants versus Catholics. That was the division that made up the troubles of that I think have settled down, I hope for the good in recent years. But there were at least three factions symbolized, if not determined, by Christian denominations. Of course, the Catholics were the largest group, and they were the original families of Ireland for the most part, and they formed one very strong contingent. Another contingent was the English Anglicans, who were loyal to the crown and were trying to further the role of the crown in Ireland, further the motives and try to strengthen the English political hold on Ireland. But then there were the Scots-Irish, so-called. They were mostly Presbyterians. They were not always loyal to the crown, and they thought of themselves as different from the English, and felt oppressed often, both by land restrictions and by the English efforts to convert them to the English Church, to bring them under the same rubric, more or less. They were the Catholics were oppressed by them as well, but they were, I think, less likely to move. And one reason was that they were Catholic and that they needed to have a priest wherever they moved to. This was not necessarily true of the Protestants, who were sometimes eager to move to America to get away from English domination. A lot of once they moved to America, and they came here over a series of decades and decades, in the late 1600s through the 1700s, certainly, and even beyond. But the Irish tended to gravitate to the frontier when they got here. They didn't settle in the port cities as many immigrant groups did. Many of them were used to living in the country, and they found that the port cities were already dominated by the people who already lived there, the Anglos mostly, and other people. But a good many of them moved to Philadelphia, the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. That's where a lot of the people who came to East Tennessee had lived before. And many of the early Knoxvillians were children or grandchildren of Irish, of immigrant refugees. And one of them was named Charles McClung. He was, I think, has a right to be called one of the founders of Knoxville. He was the son of an Irish immigrant who had lived in the Philadelphia area. And they say that he helped lay out the town and named many of downtown streets. In fact, some of them he named 4 streets that he was familiar with in Philadelphia. So he was, I mentioned him because he was kind of a typical member of the Scots-Irish community here. Not necessarily from Ireland, but of recent immigrant heritage in terms of his family. But we did have Irish immigrants here as well, from the northern part of Ireland. One is named John Adair. He was born in 1732 in County Antrim in Ulster. He came to America when he was almost 40, so he certainly had an accent. He was one of the later waves of Scots-Irish to arrive here. This is the fort that he established up in the Fountain City area. He lived, part of his property was near where Lyndhurst Cemetery is now. But even though he lived way out in Fountain City, almost 5 miles from downtown, he was a member of one of the founders of First Presbyterian Church downtown, and was also one of 2 foreign-born delegates to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention in 1796. Irish refugees were among the founders of the state of Tennessee. Irish immigrant refugees were one of the people who put together a state in this place in 1796. A couple of years later, there was an interesting and pretty tragic event that I'm afraid a lot of people don't know very much about. It was the Revolt of the United Irishmen, and this was a revolt against the crown, against the English crown, that was led not by Catholics, although many of them were sympathizers and allies, but by Presbyterians in the north of Ireland, led by one guy in particular named Wolfe Tone, who had actually lived in America, in Pennsylvania for a while before he went back to Ireland to lead this major revolt. It was an idealistic democratic revolt, partly inspired by the French Revolution, and it was viciously put down. Hundreds of people were slaughtered, leaders were killed. Wolfe Tone died in the midst of this, and at least a few revolutionary refugees came all the way to Knoxville, Tennessee. One of whom was kind of famous at home. His name was John Nevin, and he lived in a place called Ballymoney in the northern part of Ireland in County Antrim. Here's a jug that it looks like it says the farmer's arm, but this is a jug that's in the memory of John Nevin of Kilmoyle. He was one of these revolutionary leaders in his home. He was so feared by the British that they actually burned down a town, thinking that was his town mistakenly. Apparently, it was the wrong Kilmoyle. But this jug is actually on display in Northern Ireland and near Bushmills Distillery. If I can read the inscription, you can't quite see it on the side. It says, "To the memory of John Nevin, who by the foes of reform banished from his native home in June 1798, he lived in a state of exile and departed this life in Knoxville, Tennessee, ye 19th of May, 1806. Obviously, Knoxville was a misunderstanding of the word Knoxville. But that was an unusual suffix in Ireland for a city, that French suffix. But he did. We do have records of John Nevin being here. There was actually even a ballad about him in Northern Ireland called "Here's to Captain Nevin, God bless his lovely eyes." I'd love to. He's buried here somewhere. We don't know where exactly. Be careful when you dig your spring gardens this year. But he came here with a companion, at least one companion, by the way, one whose name was John Mcneil, who was the executor of his will that was probated here in Knoxville. John Mcneil's grave, I used to know where it was. It was off of Lovell Road in West Knox County. I wrote a story in Metropolis about it back in '02. And unfortunately, I think I sometimes curse things by writing glowing things, but I thought just this lovely little spot for a grave, a solo grave by itself under a tree in this meadow and off Lovell Road. And sure enough, within a couple of years, developers came in and moved it somewhere, I understand, but I don't know where. I'm sure it's not as pretty a spot as it was originally. And I don't know how much you can find of someone who's been buried there for 200 years. But anyway, these Scots-Irish and other Irish, and they weren't the only Irish here, were such a big part of Knoxville. I like to point out that our first board of aldermen in Knoxville ever in 1850, Knoxville in its early days was controlled by the state government, and there's a commission appointed by the state to take care of the city's needs. But we began developing as an independent city in 1815 and got our own board of aldermen, first city council. And it was made up of 7 men, and of those 7 men, at least 3 of them were Irish immigrants. I mean immigrants with accents, people who'd been born and raised in Ireland. And 2 others are of obscure origin, but we just know their names, and their names were McCory and Curran. So it's possible as many as 5 of the 7, and Knoxville's first city council were Irish. Of those we know were from Ireland. 2 of them were Scots-Irish. One was Thomas Humes, and who was from County Fermanagh, and one was James Park, who was from County Donegal. And we have the James Park. We remember both of them for buildings they built, but James Park's house is still standing on the corner of Cumberland and Walnut Street downtown, and is now the headquarters of the Gulf and Ohio Railroad Company. But this was built by a guy who was born and raised in Ireland. Was one of the early politicians in Knoxville. He came here after the founding of the city, so he's not really one of the founders of Knoxville, but he was our 2nd mayor ever. Our 2nd and 4th mayor was James Park, who built this house. He was a very well-known, well thought of fellow here, lived a long time, is buried at Old Gray Cemetery. And his son was a very prominent Presbyterian minister at First Presbyterian, especially downtown. There's a big portrait of his son at First Pres downtown. But also another Scots-Irish immigrant was Thomas Humes, who is the guy that built just before his untimely death in 1815. Built the front of what we know as the Bijou Theater, what we later know as the Lamar House. This was really a grand building for Knoxville in 1815, 1816, 1817, I think was when it was actually completed. But this may have been just meant to be his home. We're not exactly sure what he meant this building to be, but his wife enlisted people to run it as a hotel in those early days. But this is a grand building that was built by a guy born and raised in Ireland, who lived here and was a prominent figure here. If you know the name Thomas Humes, you may know the much better known Thomas Humes, who is his son, who is later the president of the University of Tennessee, and a very prominent guy in a lot of different ways. Also the first historian of the city of Knoxville that I know of. But an interesting and admirable guy as far as I know. But also among that first city council was one guy who was not Scots-Irish. He was Catholic Irish. He was from County Westmeath in the middle of the island. Was born in 1766 in the center of the island. He lived in Knoxville, kind of on the southwestern fringe of the city, at the fork of Main and Cumberland, down below the College Hill there, before it was College Hill, near Second Creek. He actually tried to start a Catholic church here in Knoxville back in those early days. In 1808, he invited a Catholic priest, Father Badin, who is a French origin, worked out of Bardstown, Kentucky, to come here, and he came here several times and reported on the progress of the Catholic Church here, and in those days, at least the Catholic community. But when he first came here, he reported that there were only 6 or 7 Irish Catholic families in Knoxville. And he also claimed to have preached to the Tennessee legislature. We haven't found further data about that. That's kind of obscure. But anyway, he was here a few times. He came here on I think his last trip was in 1810. He called it the Infant Church of Knoxville, as if it were already an established church. And he said that there were 12 Catholic families in Knoxville in 1812. And he referred to them as the parish of St. Andrews, even though it was not, I think that was just kind of a fanciful way to refer to them, because it was not, as far as we know, an officially established parish, but that's what he called it. Other priests visited over the years, but eventually Dardis's plan hopes to found an Irish Catholic church in Knoxville fizzled. He moved away, ended up in Winchester, Tennessee, as an old man, which is where he died. In a history of the Catholic Church in this part of the country that came out about 100 years ago, it was what happened next was called a long period of the darkest desolation, one of the saddest silences in the annals of our American church. We know that there was one mass conducted in Knoxville in 1837. There were a few more in 1848 when we were starting to see the beginning of one of the biggest catastrophes of that century, and that was the Great Famine. There are lots of theories about the cause of the Great Hunger, that caused more than 1 million people to die of starvation in the Emerald Isle, which always looks so beautiful. But they were not able. They had a potato blight, and they weren't able to grow their usual crops. They had just several bad years, but they began coming to America. More than by some accounts, more than 2 million people left Ireland, just hungry and just without any resources except to leave. And several hundred of them came to Knoxville, and the reason they came here was that we happened to be building a railroad through East Tennessee at the time. The East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad was being built in the late 1840s and early 1850s, exactly at the time that the Irish were coming to America, and they needed lots of young, strong-backed men in those days to do to chop the routes through the mountains, build the bridges, all the hard work that it takes to get a railroad into a city. And later on in 1858, the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad connected with it, and that called for lots and lots of work. So hundreds and hundreds of Irish came to East Tennessee to work. Some of them just came here and worked and went on somewhere else. Some of them, quite a lot of them, stayed. Knoxville wasn't quite sure what to make of them at first. Knoxville had never had a large number of Irish Catholic people. The first descriptions of Irish, and of course they were working class guys, they weren't necessarily educated fellows. But they were the first descriptions of the Irish in Knoxville all have to do with drinking and fighting. I found this little descriptions from July of 1855 from the Knoxville Register. A few of St. Patrick's boys pitched into each other Kilkenny cats fashion. You might know I guess it's an Irish story, the Kilkenny cats, the cats that just fought until there was nothing left of them but their claws. The result was a broken head, 2 or 3 bunged eyes, and a dead Irishman, as was supposed, but he still lives. That's all they said. We don't know what happened to the guy. He appeared to have been killed in the fight, but was survived. For how long, we don't know. But this was a period, there was a reaction, a national reaction to the Irish, especially. There were a lot of other immigrations too during this time, German immigrations, Swiss immigrations, people from Italy and other places were coming here, and America suddenly was not mostly Anglo as it had been before. And a lot of people worried about that. And I think we see echoes of that throughout our history to the present day. But one of the leaders of the reaction in Knoxville, in fact, the leader, was a guy named Parson Brownlow, who was a Methodist preacher, very well known in East Tennessee by this time. He had come here, moved to Knoxville in the late 1840s, and founded the Knoxville Whig here, which was a weekly paper. He was notable for his intolerance of anybody that was not white and Methodist, more or less. He even was one of his first books was a kind of a salvo against Presbyterianism, which he thought was a completely disreputable form of religion. He was attracted to the American Party, which was something that popped up nationally, that what you might remember from school books as the Know Nothing Party from the mid-1850s. And this was briefly something that took a hold of the Whig Party, which was very, very strong in Knoxville. And the leader of the Know Nothings here in Knoxville was Parson Brownlow. They referred to Catholicism as Romanism or Papism. There was a preacher or a speaker, at least in 1848 at Strawberry Plains, that talked about the unalterable purpose of His Holiness the Pope is to uproot the tree of liberty, And this was, a lot of this was a concern that Catholics could not possibly be Democrats, because they would always be answering to a foreign power, and that was the Pope. There was a sarcastic note in Parson Brownlow's paper about St. Patrick's Day in 1856. This is one of the earliest St. Patrick's Day we know of being celebrated here in any form, and we have the only description we have of it is from a very sober Methodist. We think this is probably Parson Brownlow himself in his words. A portion of the Irish in this city enjoyed St. Patrick's Day. We do not mean to say that they celebrated it in any given style, but that some of them rendered themselves celebrated by the abuse of the day and the intemperate use of ardent spirits. And the Catholic Irish generally would thus swallow up St. Patrick's Day and every other day in the Pope's calendar, if the Catholic Irish generally could be furnished with liquor and money to pay a corrupt and adulterous priest for the pardon of their sins. Parson Brownlow is a very interesting guy that I hate to blow by without talking about him more, because what he said and the way he lived were interesting contradictions. He could be very generous personally, even to people that he claimed to hate. And it says something about him that when we had a cholera epidemic, we used to have those in 1854, and almost everybody had left town. It was horrifying. People left town, and there were more bodies to be buried than could be buried by the people left in town. Parson Brownlow was one of the few people who volunteered to help the Irish sexton who took care of Old Grey Cemetery to bury victims of cholera. That is just a Dickensian scene. The idea of this tall, ugly Parson Brownlow with a shovel in his hand at age 50 or so, helping the much younger Irishman named Neddy Lavin, whose job it was to bury the dead. And some people, like a guy that we'll talk about later, J.P. Murphy, who was later known as the mayor of Irishtown in Knoxville, would recall Parson Brownlow fondly. It was his first employer. But anyway, he was a complicated guy that we can't really get into in great detail in less than an hour or two. But anyway, the priest that he may be referring to was the founding priest of the First Catholic Church in Knoxville, and that was Immaculate Conception, which is just 2 doors away from us here on Gallows Hill. That priest's name was Henry Vincent Brown, Father Brown, who was the first Catholic priest in town. And Father Brown was from New York, was a Presbyterian raised Catholic convert, which makes him kind of interesting. But he established Immaculate Conception in 1855. And he actually helped design the original building that we saw earlier. We'll see a picture of it again. But he was original stone chapel that was down the hill. When they built the church, the rumor was that there were vaults for the storage of gunpowder, and beneath it for the future Romanist takeover of America. Of course, we don't believe that was the case. Anyway, this large number of early Irish immigrants, and many of them were young, and it's mainly just the ones who died of disease and accidents who were buried here. But they were buried at Old Grey Cemetery, and many of them were, before there was a Catholic cemetery in town. And if you know Old Grey, probably one of the least known parts of the cemetery is the northwestern corner of the cemetery. And this aren't any really big monuments, but many of these graves, and these are some of the oldest graves in the cemetery from the 1850s and early 1860s, are graves of Irish people, and many of them have the names of their homes on the gravestones. That people were born in Ireland, there are lots of Irish names here as well. But this was just kind of the Irish Catholic corner of Old Grey. We have a couple of pictures of individual stones, don't we? Yeah, here's just an example, and it talks about native of Ireland, county. has the county name. Maybe some people can make that out, but anyway, died in 1863. A lot of these people are young, because it was mostly young people who were immigrating to America during this time. And here's another one, unusual shaft, with something that was unusual in Knoxville at the time, and this may be one of the first representations of the cross on a gravestone. Now, we think that is the most ordinary thing that you can put on a gravestone today, but the early Protestants, Presbyterians especially, did not approve of crosses on gravestones. They considered them graven images. But this was an old tradition with the Irish Catholics. So this might have startled some people when this obelisk was put up in Old Gray. I doubt this is the very first one, but it was really the Catholics that began representing the cross in graveyards in Knoxville, and the Protestants forgot what problem they had with it and kind of followed suit in their own graveyards after this. It's interesting though that before the Irish arrived, you don't see crosses in graveyards in East Tennessee. Anyway, meanwhile, I'm obliged to mention one of the most unusual and the most famous Irish immigrant of all who ever lived in Knoxville, whose name was John Mitchell. He was born in Derry in 1815. And he was not a Catholic. He was not a Presbyterian. He was not an Anglican. He was a Unitarian, of all things. But he was a leader of what was called the Young Ireland movement in the 1840s, which was a kind of a revolutionary movement. He had a newspaper called the United Irishmen, that he was an editor and publisher himself. And he advocated revolution against the crown. He comparing kind of a revival of the idea of the revolution of 1798, the old Presbyterian revolution, that Ireland should become united against the crown under this banner of the United Irishmen. But because he had advocated violence against the crown, he was arrested, jailed, and finally exiled, was sent to a penal colony in Tasmania on the other side of the planet, near Australia. He escaped somehow after a few years there, reconnected with his family, he'd started a family, had a wife and small children at this time, and came to America, lived in New York for a while, and then came to Knoxville for reasons he could never explain to his friends. But one of the reasons he came here, I have to say, was that Tennessee was a slave state. John Mitchell never owned a slave that we know of. He never lived in a place with slavery before he came here. He probably never saw a slave until he came to Tennessee, but he had already been advocating slavery as a natural state between the races. And he believed that abolitionism was an Anglo plot against the Irish. This is hard to wrap your head around, but there's there's some interesting books about it. One of which was published by UT Press a few years ago. It's called John Mitchell, Irish Nationalist, Southern Secessionist. This came out probably 10, 15 years ago. It goes into by Brian McGovern. It goes into some detail about this very, very peculiar point of view. He founded in Knoxville, he founded a ostensibly national magazine called The Southern Citizen with William Swan, a local guy who'd been mayor of Knoxville. It was also one of the co-founders of Market Square with Mr. Mabry. Both became secessionists when the war came along. Swan was elected to Confederate Congress, and Mitchell went along with him and lived in Richmond too. More about him a little bit later. But the Civil War divided the Irish, and I think there's a great book that I read a few years ago by Thomas Keneally, the same guy that wrote Schindler's List, called The Great Shame, which talks about how the different Irish people had different points of view on the Civil War when they arrived here. They almost came here from starving in Ireland and arrived just in time for the worst war in American history here, and they divided for different reasons, some of them based on their Irish background. But John Mitchell is a big part of that story, and Keneally goes into his story a good deal. Many of Knoxville's Irish, like Patrick Sullivan, who came here with his family, who were working on the railroad in those days, served in the Union Army. He became close to Cal Johnson, the former slave, and they were good friends and worked together at times. And some were Confederates. One guy was one of the most unusual Confederate generals of the war was a guy that was in Knoxville for, I think, a few weeks in 1862. His name was Patrick Cleburne. He was from County Cork. I think the only Confederate general I know of who was an Irish immigrant, and had a really interesting idea. As soon as President Lincoln proposed the Emancipation Proclamation, he said, well, the only thing for us to do is to counter it and say, we're going to free the slaves too. And he made this proposal to fellow Confederate generals in a formal setting. Got some support, but not a whole lot. And the idea finally kind of got watered down over the years until finally the Confederate Congress said, well, we'll give freedom to people who fight for the Confederacy, to former slaves who fight for the Confederacy. By the end of the war, by the way, Cleburne was dead. He was killed at the Battle of Franklin. But an interesting guy that I would like to know more about, but an Irishman who was a Confederate abolitionist, if you can imagine such a thing. But another was Father Abram Ryan, who was I think had succeeded Father Brown as the pastor at Immaculate Conception. He was known as the poet priest of the Confederacy. He was a poet and wrote some sympathetic but not warlike poetry about the war. The Conquered Banner is his best known poem, and it's I think may be misunderstood, but it may not. I don't know his mind, but he seems to be saying after the war, he's saying, let's put this behind us, fold the flag and put it away. Let's not fly it anymore. But an interesting guy later on proposed a Catholic holiday for general adoption in America known as Halloween. He thought this would help convert people to Catholicism by celebrating Halloween. This was something that he did later on in his life. By the way, Father Ryan is the name is well known in two other cities in Knoxville in the South. One is Nashville and one is Mobile, Alabama. Because he was posted at both of those places, and there are schools or other facilities named for him in other places. But a fascinating guy who lived in Knoxville for about 2 years, and he and Parson Brownlow were fierce enemies. And Father Ryan once wrote a poem celebrating Parson Brownlow's descent into hell. Because he had heard the rumor. Parson Brownlow was kind of sickly, and I think throughout his life there were rumors that he had died, and this was one of many false rumors that Brownlow had died. Anyway, an interesting fellow. Anyway, back to another interesting fellow that we talked about earlier, John Mitchell. I want to just finish talking about him. He had in the war had two sons who fought for the Confederacy and died for the Confederacy. One at Gettysburg. But he went to New York after the war and published something called the Irish Citizen, in which he kept flogging the idea that slavery, we should revive slavery and bring it back. This was and saying that secession was good, and even attacked Robert E. Lee because he was soft on slavery. And he thought this was important. And he was jailed for a while up in the North, but then went back to Ireland, where, believe it or not, he was elected to British Parliament, and died before he could reach his seat. It actually literally died on his way to London to take his seat, representing his district in Ireland. But a bizarre character, and it just shows you some of the different points of view on the war. But it was probably after the Civil War, and one good thing about the Civil War is that it seemed to abolish this anti-immigrant thing that had been going on in the 1850s, the anti-Irish thing that was going on. I think even Parson Brownlow decided that the Irish weren't so bad. It was after the war the Irish began celebrating publicly in big ways. There were several proposals for festivities on St. Patrick's Day in the 1860s. Several of them were spoiled by March rains, like several years in a row. But finally, in 1869, there was a big celebration in Knoxville. And we're showing this picture not because this is a picture of the celebration. This is the only picture we have of Gay Street in 1869. But the descriptions of this St. Patrick's Day celebration, March 17th, 1869, are really extravagant. It began with a celebration at the church, an oration by Father Finnegan. There was a huge parade that began at City Hall, which was then on Market Square. There was green bunting up and down Gay Street. There were women representing the Goddess of Liberty and the Maid of Erin. This may have been a response to this idea that Catholicism was the enemy of democracy, just to show how well they got along in a parade. These two beautiful young women, personified by Becky Abernathy, who was the Goddess of Liberty, and Mary Kennedy, who was the Maid of Erin, plus 32 maidens representing the 32 counties of Ireland were all part of this parade. The Board of Aldermen took part of it. And this, by the way, was the first year, 1869, the first year that there were black men in the Board of Aldermen. So there were black men in this St. Patrick's Day parade, riding in an omnibus, which was probably a horse-drawn carriage. Father Finnegan himself was in a barouche carriage in the parade. And the largest group, I think, that had planned the parade was the St. Patrick's Benevolent Society, and there were about 50 people involved in that. And there was a slightly smaller group, which is kind of surprising, Fenians. That was kind of the radical Irish faction, the Irish Nationalist faction. They even had a chapter here in Knoxville with at least 30 members. They paraded in red caps and green jackets and carried a banner that said "God Save Ireland." This was all in 1869. There was a good deal of anxiety that something might happen, because people who remembered when there was antipathy against the Irish or the Catholics, and also people who worried about the Fenians. But the newspaper reported, "Nothing calculated to mar the pleasure and harmony of the day occurred. Our Irish fellow citizens will long have reason to remember with pleasure the celebration of St. Patrick's Day, 1869. There was an all-night dance at the Lamar House that became kind of a regular thing, and I wonder whether they were aware that it had been built by an Irish Presbyterian more than half a century earlier. But later that year, 1869 was a very big deal for the Irish Catholics, because it was later that year that, and by the way, I love to look at this picture of Gay Street. I don't know what these guys are up to. They look kind of challenging in a way. But they talked about every building had green bunting on it all the way up and down the street, and it must have been just quite a sight to behold. But that was a great year for Irish Catholics, because later that year they established Calvary Cemetery. The Irish had been buried, I mentioned, at Old Grey before that, and some continue to be buried at Old Grey. That wasn't the end of Irish Catholic burials there, but they began having a lot of Irish Catholics being buried at Calvary Cemetery, which is now on MLK near Vine Middle. There was a big parade from downtown. They loved parades, the Irish did, and had this giant parade apparently with bands and not just Irish, but lots of people were involved in this parade. But this is something I didn't know until I researched this talk today. The graveyard was consecrated by Bishop Patrick Thean, who is from Tipperary, and he's remarkable because he was later the first Archbishop of Chicago, but he was based in Nashville at the time that he was the bishop for Tennessee, and he came here to Knoxville to consecrate this cemetery in 1869. And if you go there today, it's a fascinating place. They're okay with statues and crosses and everything else that had been avoided in Protestant cemeteries before this. But there are lots of Irish names here, lots of interesting Irish people buried here. We have a couple of pictures of this, don't we, Paul? Yeah. Here's a Patrick Mahoney from County Cork, buried there. James Quinn, you see back there from another County Kildare. Kind of classic classic Irish names from classic Irish counties, all through Calvary. And the Fitzgerald, and you see another cross up there at the top. And a few kind of well-known people are buried here. Yeah, here's another picture of James Quinn. You see the crosses and the statues in Calvary. But we talking about some people are buried here. What Patrick Callahan buried here in parish of Castle Island, County Kerry. Castle Island, County Kerry, that's what it is. But yeah, 1884. These were all people who were refugees from all these older folks at least were refugees from the Great Hunger in Ireland. But a lot of these people lived though in a place called Irish Town, and one of the first people to make a name for himself is the next one, Mr. Sullivan, Paul. One of I've got Paul always gives me a list, and I always misplace it before the talk. Yeah, here's Sullivan's Saloon, now known as Lonesome Dove, but a familiar figure for anybody who lives in Knoxville. This is a photograph from the 1970s, and surprisingly, it's one of the oldest photographs we know of. Hardly anyone took a photograph of this that we know of. This building was built in 1888, and in fact was built during the administration of an Irish Catholic mayor. But it was Patrick Sullivan was one of these early immigrants who came here as a child. He was born in Ireland, but grew up mostly in Tennessee. But established a saloon on Central Street very soon after the Civil War, and did very, very well. He apparently was good at it, and built this in 1888, probably the most elaborate saloon ever built in Knoxville. It was one of several Irish saloon keepers, and I think it's worth mentioning this because it was I think they brought a new approach to drinking in bars. We had taverns before this, but saloons became kind of the equivalent of what they had known as pubs in Ireland. There were places, just gathering places, where a lot of people, you might come and meet a lot of people you don't know, or see your friends. Kind of friendly places that people could get together and swap ideas. This was sometimes known as Pat's Barn, kind of an undignified name for such a cool old Richardsonian Romanesque building. But it was remarkable looking in retrospect, because in 1888 this place was open, and it was open to everybody. Patrick Sullivan did not discriminate based on race or gender. Both those were very unusual at the time. Women were usually only allowed to walk into the back of a saloon and to get a growler or a beer to take home. But Patrick Sullivan invited them in the front door, and he did the same with black people. This was a part of town where black and white met each other. But this was just a remarkable place. We're really lucky that we still have it. Patrick Sullivan had a sometime partner named Daniel DeWine, who made his own beer. But do we have what's next, Paul? Is it the picture of
cemetery photos?
Yeah, here we go. Yeah, here's the Sullivan grave, which is in Calvary Cemetery, the Catholic cemetery on the east side of downtown. But thought we'd show that because it's right in the very center of the cemetery. He's one of the best known Irish people in town at the time. All right, I'll put on the list here, Paul. Thanks. This is a guy who was often a partner with Patrick Sullivan. In fact, it was called DeWine and Sullivan and DeWine's for one time. DeWine was a partner with him at Sullivan's Saloon, but he had his own saloon before that. He was known for making his own beer. I'm not sure whether Patrick Sullivan did that, but Dan DeWine ran a brew pub, and this is he and his wife. Dan DeWine was born in Knoxville, I believe, but from an Irish family, and married a woman with a very Irish name. I think she died a good many years before he did. But Dan DeWine was fated to be a very important guy in the history of the healthcare industry in Knoxville, even though he was a saloon keeper, a career saloon keeper. He made his own beer in a place on Central Street, about half a block away from Patrick Sullivan's. And there are a few, just a few examples of his work. He had a distinctive jug that he sold beer in that you can still find copies of, and they actually go for a good deal of money. Apparently, this is his previous saloon before he was working out with Patrick Sullivan. But Dan and Pat was either Patrick Sullivan or his son or brother. I think it might have been a member of the DeWine family. Pat was obviously a pretty common name in the Irish community. But this was an example of a growler, basically, is what we would call it, that you would get a jug full of beer and take it home from his place down in Central Street, which is known as the Bowery. By the way, there were other people besides Irish, of course, who had saloons, but there was a large number of Irish people who ran saloons. The Germans ran the breweries, the big breweries, but the Irish ran the brew pubs and the saloons. Here's Dan DeWine's grave at Calvary Cemetery. But there were, if you look around town, there were so many interesting folks I would love to know more about. There was a guy named Red Mike, who had a saloon on Market Square called Red Mike's. His name was Mike Cullinan. I guess he had red hair, an Irishman with red hair, imagine that. But down around, especially down around Central Street, is where there were so many Irish saloons, and we'll get into why in just a minute. But near Sullivan's place, there was another saloon run by a guy named O'Byrne, a guy named Shea, a guy named Kavanaugh, a guy named Moriarty, all on Central Street, very close to the railroad there, which was so important to why Irish came here to begin with, to work with the railroad. But we also have before we move away from graveyards, I want to talk about a guy named Thomas Ridge, who was from County Galway in Ireland. And we have, do we have him next, Paul? Is that, yeah, this is the Thomas Ridge Memorial. Now, this is at National Cemetery. And if you know, National Cemetery is known for its uniform, small government issued graves. And this is obviously not that. It's a high Victorian sort of, looks like a Catholic grave. And there are lots of symbols on all four sides of it about, he's very proud of his Irish heritage. And you can see that on the grave itself. Thomas Ridge was an interesting guy because he was the superintendent of the National Cemetery. This is one of the oldest national cemeteries in America. And Thomas Ridge was the superintendent of it. And he was a former Union cavalryman. And he claimed to be the only veteran, the only soldier to ever be in charge of a national cemetery, the only soldier who'd seen combat. But he lived at the graveyard on a little house on the corner. And he and his wife took care of the place and kind of kept it decorated with planted flowers and things. And we're very proud of it. And when they died, the cemetery organization made an exception for them and gave them the right to have non-compliant tombstones like they might have had in Ireland or in the Catholic cemetery in Knoxville. But I mentioned earlier the saloon keepers along Central, especially around the railroad, and that was the beginning of something that became known as Irish Town. Irish Town was the Irish community of Knoxville, and it was where a lot of the Irish immigrants lived. And here's a bit of a close-up. If you saw that, you could see the word from Ireland on that. But yeah.
Sorry, I was a bit behind.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, I should have been paying attention to the notes here. But we're talking about Irish Town. But that was this is the best photograph I know of the area that was known as Irish Town, and doesn't look like very much. You see the bridge across there. That's now the Gay Street Viaduct. There aren't many buildings in there. You can kind of see the building along Jackson that's called the Jackson Terminal. is there. It may be a predecessor to that building, but roughly that's what that is. But we're looking off into the distance. Those houses in the background were in what was known as Irishtown, and they lived close to the for two reasons. One was close to the railroad, where many of them still worked in the late 19th century, and they also lived close to the only Catholic church in Knoxville, which was Immaculate Conception. But this was Irishtown was a place described once a place of about 50 families, but they were big Irish Catholic families, so there were perhaps as many as 400 people living in Irishtown. They had a lot of almost an independent community. They had Miss Mary O'Donoghue's restaurant and bakery was there. They had their own boxing ring on the corner of Central and Depot, and above a saloon, kind of a classic old-fashioned scene. They had a rugby field that were in around 1880. They were playing rugby, and I wonder if this is the first time that many Tennesseans saw the game that we came to know as football, played by Irish immigrants down there. They also learned to play baseball, the American sport, and some were very good at it. But there were personalities in Irishtown. There was a guy named Mike O'Connor who had a trained steam whistle, a big thing, and was able to actually make different tones out of it, and could even play tunes with it. Was very proud of that. But Timothy Spillane, who was a Union veteran, and not just any Union veteran, but he was a veteran of the fierce fighting at Petersburg, Virginia, won the Medal of Honor for valor in that fighting. I think the first Medal of Honor winner to be buried in Knoxville. He's one of only two at National Cemetery. But he was best remembered and best known in Irishtown, not as a noble Medal of Honor winner, but as a storyteller, a saloon storyteller is how they talked about it. But I guess he would tell stories about the Civil War in the saloons of Irishtown. Stories of this are fascinating, and we'll get into how we began learning about Irishtown later on. But the one thing fascinating about the Irish, and you see this throughout America, is that they were very active politically, just almost right off the bat, at least soon after the Civil War. By 1864, Samuel McClanahan was on city council, Martin Shea in 1866, Patrick Shea 1878. Patrick Sullivan's son, Michael, was an alderman in 1870, and then his father apparently liked the sound of that himself, so he ran, and the two of them served together, father and son, on city council in the 1870s, alongside some of the first African-American council members. Also, the Condon family was very politically active. Michael in 1883 was on the board of aldermen. Stephen in 1884, alongside Michael, he had a couple of brothers who were from an Irish family on the same city council. But they were all from the 8th and 9th wards, especially the 8th ward, which was the Irish ward. And that's what we're looking at here. That was the Irish voting district. And they all voted at a place, their polling place was a barber shop on Depot Street. But a younger brother of the two Condons we just mentioned was most famous as a baseball player early on. He was a member of the Knoxville Reds, which was around 1880 was a Southern champion baseball team. They were we were very proud of our baseball team in those days. But he was a popular guy, was elected, ran for mayor in 1888, mayor of Knoxville, not of Irishtown, but of Knoxville. Ran for mayor in 1888 and won by a big margin. This was, the people wondered about this. How could he possibly have done so well? The Knoxville Journal had supported his rival, Mr. Clark, and kind of gently alleged bribery. That was what must have accounted for the fact that Condon had been elected. We don't know anything about that for sure. But the journal said the Condon men painted the town red. This is the day after the election. They talked loud, raised the Democratic yell, fired off a few skyrockets, exploded fireworks, and indulged in liquid refreshments. They were happy. They paid the fiddler and had a right to do the dancing. They danced right merrily. They later noted if Colonel Condon had been elected with 200 or 300 majority, we would not have been surprised. but 925 votes, that was his margin, which was big in those days, considering that only men could vote, and it was not a very big city. 925 vote margin takes our breath. By the way, this was 1888, and I remember, 40 years later, we were talking about whether when Al Smith ran for president, we're saying, gosh, America's not ready for a Catholic president. And in fact, this was very early for a Catholic mayor of any city. This was only less than a decade, I believe, after Boston's first Catholic mayor. But we had a Catholic mayor in 1888, 1889, and this was remarkable that he won. A young guy who had not been that politically well known before this. Mainly a baseball champ, was elected mayor of Knoxville, and that was. But his faith didn't come up in the press reporting. They said, "Isn't it amazing that we have a Catholic mayor?" Nobody said that. He was just the mayor, and that's what he was. It was during the Condon administration that Jackson Avenue was completed, and it was also I think he had something to do with something remarkable about the church that he attended, which was Immaculate Conception. That when they built the new church to replace the original one, it was and I think we have a picture of that. It had a tall steeple on it, and the city made a deal. The city, perhaps with Mayor Condon involved, to put a clock tower in the steeple. The city would help pay for the church's steeple because there was no elevation so high in the whole downtown part of Knoxville as this amazing steeple up on top of the hill on the north side of downtown. And from that steeple, you could see the clock in those days from Market Square, and you could see it from the railroad station. So people literally caught trains by looking up at the Catholic steeple with the Knoxville clock on it. And Knoxville took care of that clock for many years, independently, in cooperation with the church. But anyway, this is an old picture with the old St. Mary's school, and which I think once had something like a convent in it, where nuns lived. But it was a Catholic school, kind of elementary school was up there near the Immaculate Conception, the second Immaculate Conception Church. And here's the church, the front of the church as it is today. And I like to note that it's the only church that faces away from the center of downtown, the only downtown church that faces to the north. And why does it do that? Of course, it faces toward Irish town. Irish would get up in the morning and they would see the church up there at the top of the hill. I want to go back to Condon for just a minute to talk about what happened to him. For many years, no one knew what happened to Condon. I noticed like 20 years ago, there was a portrait of him, that portrait we just saw in the City County building, and it had his birth date, but not his death date. There's a question mark about that, about when he died. And I thought I'd research that. Historians are fascinated with question marks because usually you think you'd know when a mayor had died. But I found out that he had one of the most remarkable careers of an ex-mayor in Knoxville history. He got into the snuff tobacco business, first in Nashville and then in nationally. It was actually a major a snuff tycoon, I think you could say, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and had a mansion up in I think in Long Island. It was a very, very, very wealthy, a multimillionaire in the early 20th centuries. But he would come back, never made a big deal of coming back to Knoxville, but he would come back to East Tennessee and would often stay at Tate Springs, just outside of town, with his family. But died in Memphis in 1940, I believe. But anyway, an interesting guy who might be a subject of a book someday. But anyways, it was about this same time that a saloon keeper named Kavanaugh opened a saloon on North Central Street near Anderson, and that is remembered as kind of the beginning of what we know as Happy Holler. Kavanaugh had noticed that many farmers coming into town would hit that dip that we now call the holler and would get their cart full of produce bogged down in mud. Sometimes would break an axle or a wheel or something, and they needed a beer, and he opened a saloon down there, and that was the beginning of around 1885, the beginning of that little section that became known as Happy Holler. But over the years, the organized Irish community changed a little bit. There was the ancient order of Hibernians. Had several people had been members of that before. Hibernia is the old Latin name for Ireland. Was formally organized here in 1896. I think it was around to some degree before that. But it was organized at Patterson Hall, which was what's now the corner of Central and Broadway, very close to old Irish town. And they we know I've run across a few interesting St. Patrick's over the years. By the late 1890s, they'd gotten kind of tame compared to the big all-night dance party and giant parade that it had been in the 1860s. 1897 is really almost like a show. It was at Corona Hall on Market Square. There were singers and dancers and piano recitals, but it was mainly something and called character sketches. I guess it was comedians. But it had mainly a seated thing, kind of like a vaudeville show that you would enjoy. And there was an address by a guy named John P. Murphy, who was the mayor of Irishtown. This was an unofficial role, but John P. Murphy, I think, relished that title. He was Irish through and through, could speak Gaelic and conversationally, and I think he tried to encourage other people to do so. But even though he was born in Hawkins County in 1857 to Irish immigrants from County Kerry, he was a printer by trade. He was a professional printer and was known to study Shakespeare. Do we have the picture of Murphy? Paul, is that next? Yeah, but he was. He studied Shakespeare. He knew Shakespeare back and forth. He liked to take on projects and learn things like the Gaelic language. Later took on, in his 40s, decided he wanted to be a lawyer and took on the law, became a tax attorney. But he was elected alderman in 1890, was elected to state legislature in 1893. He was a member of lots of organizations, the Catholic Knights, the Ancient Essenic Order, the Ancient Order of Hibernians I mentioned earlier, and the Mystic Wheelmen. I would love to know more about the Mystic Wheelmen. When you hear about wheelmen in that era, it's usually bicyclists, but these were mystic wheelmen that John Paul Murphy was a member of. But he was briefly interim mayor of Knoxville after the death of Mayor Mcneil. He had been kind of acting mayor during Mcneil's long absence and illness when in 1903 and 1904, when Mcneil was not even in Knoxville. He was in New York seeking treatment for what might have been prostate cancer and was very, very ill during this time. And Murphy kind of took over for him. And because he'd been kind of acting for Mcneil during this time, they made him mayor of Knoxville for the balance of his term after Mcneil died in New York. And Murphy was mayor of Knoxville for 8 days. And this is the number 8 keeps returning in his career. He returned to his seat as alderman. He was 8 times alderman of the 8th ward that I mentioned earlier was the Irish ward. And later still had a national role, was postmaster for the U.S. Senate under Wilson. But they called him mayor of Irishtown as it was a ceremonial title. He would go to funerals and they would sometimes represent Irish concerns as an advisor to the city if needed. He would talk about what the 8th ward needed. Everybody knew him whether he was elected or not. He would be there elected, and it would be there representing his people, the Irish of the 8th ward. He probably never went to Ireland in his early years, but he did go to County Kerry in his later years and enjoyed long periods of time there. But eventually moved back and was still living in old Irishtown, was one of the last people, dwindling number of people living there when he died there in 1925. He lived on William Street, which still exists, and goes under the interstate now, but that William Street was one of the key streets of Irishtown. And when he died in 1925, it says something about him and the Irish. He never married. He just devoted his life to his career. But his pallbearers were his 6 nephews. Can you imagine? It says something about the size of Irish families and also the devotion of Irish families, that you would have 6 nephews to bury you, even if you didn't have any children of your own. It was before he was still around when the church got big enough to have a second church. Holy Ghost was established and kind of on North Central Street. And it kind of reflected the suburbanization of the Irish. A lot of the Irish were moving to the north side by then. Many of them were in what we now know as Old North and Forth and Gill. A lot of those people were second generation Irish immigrants living there. But it was on St. Patrick's Day in 1908 that Bishop Thomas Byrne, from the state bishop from Nashville, came and laid the cornerstone for the Holy Ghost Church on North Central. Father George Mahoney of St. Louis spoke on behalf of the building fund. Now this is the original Holy Ghost Church that's there in 1908. It's been used by other churches since then, but the church didn't tear it down. This is a really unusual circumstance of keeping the original church, but then building the new church next door to it. This was the Holy Ghost Church for only 18 years, from 1908 to 1926, when they built the new Holy Ghost Church, and which is still the main one today. A beautiful building on the interior, especially. And there's the Holy Ghost Church right down there, very close to Happy Holler, where Kavanaugh had his saloon. But over the years, as the original immigrants got older and died off, there were you see dwindling efforts to celebrate St. Patrick's Day and other things. There was a Hibernian ball on April 1st in 1918. But by then, a lot of young Irish, I think, wanted to seem American, maybe were embarrassed by their parents who wanted to go singing and dancing on St. Patrick's Day. And St. Patrick's finally faded into sort of a sing-along for elderly people at the old market hall in the 1920s. Patrick Sullivan and John P. Murphy both died in 1925, and Dan DeWine not after. And Dan DeWine's death was significant because he had a major bequest which changed the city of Knoxville. Dan DeWine had bought some land on the north side of town in the Oak Hill area. And after his wife had died, and after his daughter died young as well, he decided to establish a hospital in her honor, the first Catholic hospital in Knoxville history, and that was he owned Oak Hill on the north side of town, and it was his bequest, kind of a surprise bequest to the Catholic Church to establish a Catholic hospital, and that became St. Mary's Hospital, named in honor of his daughter. But it's amazing. This guy that made his living as a saloonkeeper was the guy who has helped establish a hospital that lasted there for almost a century. And we do have the remnant of St. Mary's. We have a picture of the original St. Mary's, don't we, Paul, from not very long after. It was built almost immediately after DeWine's death up on Oak Hill.
We did have a picture of it. I seem to have lost it.
Okay, yeah, that's
sorry, it's disappeared.
The original building is a beautiful building. I'm glad that they're uncovering it to show what the hospital that I think that Dan DeWine intended to create. But meanwhile, we kind of had forgotten about the Irish for a long time, with this major exception of St. Mary's Hospital. But in 1931, we elected a guy named John T. O'Connor to be mayor of Knoxville. He was an Irish Catholic guy, was very popular with all classes, was a Democratic politician, but he had been born in a place called Irishtown, and people started talking about his background, especially after he got elected mayor. And it learned that he had come to this place called Irishtown, and by the 1930s, people were saying, "Gosh, what was Irishtown?" It was almost evacuated of Irish by this time, and it was a subject of fascination. And John T. O'Connor was over and over telling stories about Irishtown. And they started talking to other people, other newspaper writers began, like Lucy Templeton, started talking to other people who remembered Irishtown and trying to map it out exactly where was it, because people had already forgotten by that time. It really had flourished. Irishtown had between the 1860s and the 1890s, and was kind of beginning to decline by the early 1900s. But thanks to this flurry of interest, we and including me, like as a historian, we had access to these descriptions of Irishtown that might not have existed if Mayor O'Connor had not been elected when he was, because we had a lot of good writers who were interested in getting to the bottom of these things. In 1949, Lucy Templeton, who had written about Irishtown before, went to interview what she thought was the last resident of Irishtown, a woman named Kate Leahy Ammons, who lived down on the 200 block of Magnolia, which was in one of the original houses. And that was 1949. Much of what remained of Irishtown was torn down by the interstate highway construction in the 1950s. But anyway, almost all, I had thought that every part of Irishtown was gone. But there is one building that I'm glad is still there, and it's on the corner of Central and Depot Street. And this was a place that I'd read about because it had been a saloon, an Irish saloon. Oh, there's the hospital picture. Yeah, all right. Well, this is the saloon that had been a saloon in 1890. This was an Irish saloon on the ground floor, and on the second floor was a boxing ring. That's just a classic scene from a 1930s movie, having a saloon downstairs and going upstairs to see a boxing match. But this was right there, and it was right diagonally across the street from what had been the rugby pitch and the Irish baseball field across the street there, which is now the White Lily Flower building, which I think was built in 1885 on top of what had been the athletic field for Irishtown. But we're lucky this building is still there, and it's a bar. And I've been there a couple of times, but it's a worthy successor of Irishtown, and maybe the last architectural remnant of Irishtown. Right across the street, by the way, was a place called Long's, Jim Long's, which was I think the longest live bar. I forgot to put it in my notes, but he was an Irishman too, and had a bar that outlasted Prohibition, believe it or not. It was there throughout the whole era of Prohibition, which lasted in Knoxville a good deal longer than other places. But we banned saloons in 1907, and he just kept running it as a soft drink place, and his friends knew what he had and back behind the counter, and he just kept selling it to them. It did not close until the 1970s, believe it or not, when it had to be torn down for an expansion that White Lily Flower was making at the time. I think they needed a parking lot. But anyway, that's the basic outline of the story of Irish, a couple of centuries of Irish in Knoxville, and it's, I think, just scratching the surface of what of all the stories that might be out there. Irish love stories, and I love stories too. But I know that there are lots of other stories out there, and anyone else that has Irish stories, I would love to hear them either now or later.